We do have a very serious topic to get to, and I want to warn people it does contain some disturbing abuse tales. We're talking about the situation at the Face School for decades ago. It was these abuses spanned about 20 years, and in this investigation, which happened over many years from the Montreal Gazette, we hear some of the stories about kids who were abused by someone, by I suppose a principal under their care. And Child Dunlevy over the weekend wrote a feature about this very disturbing and very long-standing series of abuses at the Face School. Cha, thanks for joining us on this.
Thank you.
Tell us a bit about the offender. This was, I believe, the principal at the time?
Well, yes, even more than the principal. Philip Bonnier was the co-founder and principal of Face School. He was principal of Victoria School before that, and Face was kind of created out of Victoria School in 1975. And the old Victoria School building was on the corner of de Maisonneuve and Guy Street. And then in the late 70s, once it was Face, it moved over to its current location on University Street.
I want to mention, just read out a couple lines from your piece over the weekend that was quite chilling. It was May 1985 during Face School's annual weekend-long Grade 5 trip to Camp Canawana in the Laurentians near Saint-Sever. Carl said he saw Bagniette walk over and sit on a boy's bed. Bagniette began by, quote, caressing the kid and talking to him, Carl told the Gazette. I remember gasping, us all looking at each other, feeling powerless. There's nothing we can do. He's our effing principal. That's when he comes for me. Just very terrifying stories. How many kids were abused, and why did it take so long to figure this out?
Well, that's the big story. That's the big question, rather, of this investigation. It's a bit mind-boggling, really. I mean, we started this investigation at the Gazette after a class action lawsuit was launched against Philip Bonnier in 2023, in February 2023, and I started looking into it. And the more I looked, the more I found. I started contacting old students. I'm actually a Face alumnus myself. I went to Face in the 1980s, so around this period. So I took out two old yearbooks I had and started contacting, just one by one old students, and then eventually I kept hearing more stories. But there were criminal charges against him. He died just this past April, but there were criminal charges against Bonnier. There were 17 charges against him in Ontario involving 8 victims of kids who had been brought to and allegedly abused at his farm, and on school trips or by private invitation. And then there were these trips to Camp Canawana in the Laurentians, these school trips by Face School. So there were 8 or 9, even 10 victims that were involved in these criminal charges in Ontario and Quebec, and then I found at least another 10 victims. So that's up to 20 alleged victims, and then who's to say after that? But there were a lot of kids over the years, over 2 decades, who had stories. A lot of them similar kinds of situations. Being taken out to the country on school trips or otherwise, and then at nighttime receiving visits from their principal, and kind of situations of alleged molestation happening. And a lot of them were affected for years by this.
You write that while he was at Face, there were parents, teachers, youth protection officials, police, and even those at the highest level of the Protestant school board that knew about the allegations made against the principal, and yet he remained. Yes.
I mean, that becomes, aside from obviously the stories of alleged abuse, which are heartrending. My investigation really dug into this, like who knew what and when. And I mean, even in the 70s, there were people that I found out may have known at the school board. But then in the mid-80s, there was one mother at Face when her son came back from a trip to Camp Canawana, and she started digging into this because he said he was abused, and then she found other parents who said their kids were abused. They went to youth protection. They went to police. Police investigated. The PSBGM investigated in 1988. They conducted their own internal investigation. And they determined it had been a couple of years since what happened. They couldn't say for sure what exactly had happened. They sent him a warning letter saying you couldn't have kids out to the country or be involved in these school trips anymore. But then there was, in the class action lawsuit, the guy who launched the class action lawsuit was abused the year after that in 1989. So it didn't stop Bonnier from participating in these school trips. Yes, I mean, the school board definitely knew about it, the PSPGM, and he did stay. I mean, like the director of the PSPGM at the time even knew about it, and he did stay on board as principal until 1991 at FACE. So he was there for 16 years at FACE, and plus the years he was at Victoria School before that. And even after that, a year later, in 1992, the PSPGM put him as principal of Outremont High School, and it was reopened as École Secondaire Outremont. The following year, like a French school, he was principal there until 1998. So for another at least 6 years, maybe even a bit past 1998. So nothing. He never received official sanctions, even after the police investigated. They decided there wasn't enough to press charges. So it's kind of baffling, all of this, really.
This incident about a kid that died on the guy's property, that's a little disturbing. Do we know any more about that? Is it possible that he could have been involved in a killing?
Anything is possible. The circumstances are a bit muddy around the death. We do have news clippings from the time. I mean, Philip Bonnier was driving a tractor. There were 3 boys he had invited to his farm that weekend. This I found out. The fact of the 3 boys, I mean, that was in the news clippings from the time, from the Ottawa Citizen. I spoke to one of their boys, who is now obviously a man, a 65-year-old man, who was on the tractor. Philip Bonnier was driving the tractor back to his farmhouse at the end of the afternoon, and the 3 kids were in the scoop of the tractor. And apparently he was raising and lowering the scoop as a bit of a game, and then the scoop dropped, and the 3 kids fell off, and one of the kids was run over and killed by the tractor. Obviously a horrible accident. This 13-year-old kid died. And I spoke to the guy's sister in my article, so, there are details about that. And one of the other guys, I spoke to his wife, and then I spoke to a guy who was actually on the tractor. So it definitely happened. And one of the other kids who was on the tractor was an alleged victim of abuse. So there's a lot of, hazy, cross... I don't know, cross-pollination of things happening at the time with these kids invited to the farm and it leading to a death. And then even after that, there were allegations of more abuse at his farm. So he continued to invite boys to his farm after that. It's really a terrible story.
So when you were there, did you heard rumors, or was there any indication that something strange was going on?
There were rumors at FACE at the time. There were a lot, students knew different things. There were rumors about his drinking because... it was kind of visible at times that there was some kind of issues with alcohol, and a lot of different people knew about that, including students. And then different students knew different levels of rumors because, there were kids that would come back from these camps with stories, and then the stories would spread. So depending how close you were to those kids, then you might hear different kinds of rumors. In my year, we didn't hear anything explicit like to this extent, but there were rumors circulating at the time.
Dunlevy, a veteran reporter with the Montreal Gazette, and telling us this disturbing story over the weekend about the long-standing abuses throughout the 90s and prior at the FACE School, and the remaining resolution there that the courts will work out. Cha, thanks so much for a difficult assignment and an important one for us all to learn from.
Thank you very much, Dan.